Good morning, everybody. Let's give everyone time to get into our webinar. Thank you. Morning, Colin.
Morning. Hi there.
Excellent. Well, thank you for everyone for joining. We shall give it a few seconds or minutes to get everyone through the door at 11 o'clock. Thank you very much for everyone for joining. Excellent. Thank you everyone for joining. We shall get ready with the show in just a minute. Okay. Well, good morning, everybody. My name's Jonathan Warren. I'm the Chief Executive of Localis, the independent think tank of Place. And thank you everyone for joining the launch webinar for our latest report, Heart of the Matter, Getting to Grips with Whole Place Transformation. And this is the webinar in which we'll be looking at the foundational case for whole place transformation. We have a number of speakers who I will introduce shortly to debate this with you. And I'm very much hoping, seeing that the cast list of people joining the webinars, that we won't be short of comments, questions and queries to keep our debate and exchange going until we finish exactly, if not before, high noon at 12 o'clock. So many thanks, everybody. So just to set the scene for today, Localis have been working very closely with IMPOWER over the course of this year to really, in preparation for a new political cycle. We didn't realise at the outset how that it would be sort of abridged by 6 months, but I guess we've all played catch up by now to really look at what the agenda for placemaking, for local public services and local economies would have to look like in the new parliament. So we're driven by those dynamics because I think we're right in saying we feel we're on the edge of a considerable and major shift in how we shape so many things, our built environment, our local economic ambitions, how we create inclusive places and deliver valued local public services. So the work we've done, we had 4 evidence sessions taking us to Newcastle, Manchester, Birmingham, London, as well as an extensive desk research and interviews, was to try and get a grip on this sea change, to really say, well, look, if we are about to shift the pattern, the paradigm for place-based provision and policy over the course of the next decades, what would this look like if all the elements, social, economic, demographic, as well as the environmental and the physical, combine? How would we best go about creating the best place-based policy? And I think, though, that hopefully everyone who's joining the call will have seen we've sent you a copy of the report in advance to help prime you. But we think the circumstances call for a reform agenda which will have to take in the positive hopes for devolution through the legislations going through and that very localist bottom-up community empowerment. But we can't shy away from the sombre realities of fiscal headroom, which will be given more news of how it might be getting worse before it gets better in the October 30th budget. And of course, all importantly, the comprehensive spending review, which will succeed the one-year financial settlement, as well as the need to overcome years of sluggish economic growth to make this all pay for itself. So we've been very proud to be working with IMPOWER to investigate the next agenda for place-based reform. And we've presented the fruits of our research. I hope everyone's seen it. If not, grab a copy from the Localis website. And the purpose of today's launch webinar is to really set out from the outset what is the foundational case for whole place transformation. Why is it back on the agenda for both placemaking and service provision? And what might it ultimately, and that is in terms of that hope-filled vision, deliver for our communities and localities in the next political cycle. Now, to aid me on my quest, I will be aided and abetted by Sean Hanson, the Chief Executive of IMPOWER. I'll also be joined by Councillor Abby Brown, Chair of the Local Government Association's Improvement and Innovation Board, and good old Professor Colin Copus, Localis Fellow Emeritus, which means you've earned it, mate, I guess, Colin. So many thanks for that. Sad news, Kate Martin, the Executive Director for City Futures at Sheffield City Council, sadly can't make today's session. So apologies for anyone. Hope to hear from her. But that is our agenda for today, to make the use of the next 55 minutes to talk through why we do need to focus on whole place financial, whole place reform, what it means for our local economies, service provision, and the financial local ecosystem to keep it all together. So I will very shortly ask our speakers in order of Sean, if that's okay, followed by Abby and Colin. In terms of the guiding questions for today, we want to ask about the challenges and opportunities for radically transforming local public services. It's quite timely, is it not, today? You've got the media attention, the national news focusing on NHS reform, where the guiding element there is, well, it's not extra staff or money, it's just reforming what you have already as much as everything else. And how will this work along with the planned legislation, the English devolution bill, and the planning reform we have set? So challenges for radical transformation. Also, as is quite common for Localis thought pieces, what's the role of local leadership in placemaking and pursuing those twin goals of local economic growth and social prosperity? And finally, as I said, going back to the finance question, what would a long-term settlement, which we advocate for in Heart of the Matter for councils, mean in essentially ending that long-standing tension between revenue at for non-statutory services, including economic growth, and sourcing that much needed capital for long-term place prosperity? So those are the questions we're going to be asking. These are the great panelists we have to debate it. I'm expecting you to put in some very good questions and comments to keep us on our way. But to get us started, it gives me great pleasure to invite Sean Hanson, Chief Executive of IMPOWER, to give your thoughts on this piece of work we've conducted with you, Sean. Please take it away.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you very much for everybody for joining. I'm Sean Hanson, as Jonathan said, from IMPOWER, and I had the pleasure and the privilege to attend 2 of the 4 roundtable sessions for this. It does, as Jonathan's mentioned, seem like a very, very long time ago, and in terms of getting to this point, it's actually given us more of an opportunity also, I think, to respond to what we might have thought would have come into focus as a consequence of the changes that happened as a consequence of the election. Before I start, I mean, just a little bit for those of you who are not aware of who and where we are. IMPOWER aspires to be the UK's leading public sector consultancy firm for transformation. Our mission is to enhance the outcomes and drive savings for public services, and we hold a profound belief in the innate value of public services. We exist because public services can be and should be improved, and we've had frustrations that we felt that we've been held behind. Everyone who works for us is deeply committed to enhancing the pivotal role that public services play. Our approach enables organisations to make the required mindset shift and towards a focus on outcomes and working across organisational system boundaries, and provides the tools that make that easier. We start with the recognition that the problems we want to tackle are complex problems. By this, we mean that the challenges aren't easily contained and necessitate working with diverse populations with conflicting agendas. With that in mind, this is the ideal time for us to be talking about place. We were delighted to partner with Localis on this report, Heart of the Matter, and that's because place is very much back on the agenda. If we're serious about tackling inequality, we have to address spatial inequalities. If we're serious about the UK delivering the fastest rate of growth in the G7, we have to deal with the structural barriers to growth that are in place and are place related. If we want to heal the community divisions that have become most obvious quite recently, we need to tend to the places that suffered most in the past. Councils and their partners have a huge opportunity to shape their places. The government gets the importance of place, but it isn't coming with a ready-made package like it did with the Labour government that came in 1997. I suppose this gives us the opportunity that we can shape the agenda together. To seize those opportunities, we need to think about whole place transformation. As the report shows, and as we know from supporting hundreds of clients, you have to look at the whole place, the built environment, the quality of the services, and the access to those services. Leadership is essential to changing places and making growth happen. And at IMPOWER, we talk about whole place being about physical, social, and economic capital. Leadership is essential to making those connections that leadership brings to partners, that it creates for space to partners to be brave and be innovative, develops an inclusive ambition. Supporting and encouraging leadership at all levels is part of IMPOWER's way of working. Leadership at all levels enables partners to develop an inclusive vision and build confidence that change can happen. We don't want this to be a report that sits on the shelf. We want to build out from heart of the matter. The next few years will see a wave of once in a lifetime, once in a generation at least, opportunities for place leaders to attract funding, to negotiate devolved powers, create innovative, collaborative models of whole place and service transformation. We're building on this by research, this report, looking at how we support place leaders and be primed for what we call good growth. We're developing a tool that place leaders can use to assess how ready local authorities are as place leaders to seize those opportunities. We want to define what good growth means, drawing on our 25 years of experience, and we want to put in place a holistic framework to deliver change that works for everyone and for the long term. This government's agenda is already creating opportunities. We want to support every place leader to be ready, given that the government is going to ask for a growth plan and local industrial strategy from local authorities. As I say, I attended 2 of the 4 roundtables. My colleague Mark Lloyd attended the other 2. And I just want to express my thanks to the excellent attendees who gave everything and their time, without whom we couldn't have generated this report. Of course, I want to thank Localis for hosting and supporting us to be able to bring this report to you with Localis. I'm very happy to answer any questions about what we regard as being good growth, good savings, good spend. It's a very pejorative word, using the word good. But I think that as far as this conversation goes, I'd love to explore those themes more. I'll hand back to you, Jonathan.
Many thanks indeed, Sean, for all your help and support and for getting our launch webinar off to a good start. Now, next, I'm going to introduce Councillor Abby Brown. Many hats, Abby. Deputy Leader of the LGA Conservative Group, Deputy Chairman of the LGA, but also Chair of the Improvement and Innovation Board. You asked me earlier in the week, what direction. I just said, tell it like it is. So I'm very grateful to get your perspective on our research and the agenda we're pursuing in terms of whole place transformation and why you think this is so important from your perspective. So please, Abby, The floor is yours. We'd love to hear from you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Of course, one of the hats that I wear is being a trustee of Localis, which gives me the opportunity to read lots of really interesting reports around this and maybe bring some of my expertise. And of course, one of the things that I most enjoy at the moment is the fact that although I used to lead a council, I'm very open about the fact that the likelihood of me leading one in the future is quite small. So I use the opportunity of spending a huge amount of my time working with councils all over the country through the LGA, and also generally because I like a good chat with people to understand the direction of travel that they're going in. And I guess as I would describe myself as literally the woman who walked off a street and ended up leading a council, that for me, a lot of my interest is driven around leadership and the traits and behaviours that we need from politicians and the reality of the relationships that they need to have with their officers to do great things, as I had the opportunity to do in Stoke-on-Trent. So I'm going to talk very briefly around the things that I think that this report should stimulate in modern local politicians, and also where the role is for the wider sector that maybe leans a little bit into my role with the LGA. So I think, you know, as somebody who's fought elections, I am a politician. Essentially, we stand for election often on big totemic items, but actually, I think what we really need moving forward is a less partisan approach, really. I think it's very easy at moments to have seen over the last 4 years big shifts in the House of Commons and view that as being the future. But actually, I think what the last 2 general elections tell us is that the UK is becoming more marginal, and we've seen those huge changes, and we need to respond to that as a result by being more pragmatic as local leaders. And I think, you know, in terms of where that interposes with this report, certainly, you know, the comments around the need to get things done. And being pragmatic in terms of how you do that, there's lots of reasons why you may choose for political dogma, for example, not to choose to have a special purpose vehicle to move forward regeneration. But the reality is the environment within which we work means that we have to consider all the options there and maybe move into a space where we're doing the right thing rather than the thing that perhaps the colour of our rosette would maybe direct us to be the space to move into. So move away from that traditional viewpoint that perhaps we have when we stand for elections. And similarly, again, I would say, and actually I think most politicians are in this space to a degree anyway, but make an even greater effort around placemaking. Jonathan and Sean have also both mentioned local growth plans that are coming up. I chaired our Health and Wellbeing Board for several years, so became quite accustomed to looking through the JNSNA to understand what's happening there. How do we deal with the prevention agenda, and what are our burning platforms in a way? So how do we move away from those short-term gimmicks that we often stand for election, but into actually really how we make change in our place and how we deliver that? And of course that then leads into devolution, and my views around really government presents blocks often for us to fit into, but how do we respond in terms of what is best for our place around that? Because devolution means a real risk of places becoming fixated on the popularity. And, you know, I think there's a challenge, isn't there, for those places who move forward for devolution, and who's left behind, and what does that mean for them, and how do we ensure that those places where there perhaps isn't a focus on devolution aren't actually left behind, that gap doesn't become greater because they have become fixated on delivering certain totemic items politically. And finally, because I like threes, I think there's also a need for modern politicians to really understand the stakeholder landscape, who your trusted partners are, how you keep them in the loop, how you inform them. Anyone who's worked in business understanding where that fits within the RACI matrix in terms of how you deal with people, but also how you get involved from a leadership point of view and how you take your organisation with you. So in a way, when I first got elected, this was talked about as community leadership, and I think it is that role for enhanced community leadership for council leaders. So where does that fit into where the wider sector is? And wearing my LGA hat, where obviously I'm heavily involved with how we deliver to support the wider sector, I would say there is an opportunity here for us with a new government in terms of how we broaden that sector-led improvement offer with the new government. At the moment, what we do is quite tightly governed to a degree in terms of the mandate we're given by government, but we're keen as a sector organisation to broaden that conversation and to respond to the needs of our members. I sat in a meeting the other day where we were talking about community cohesion. You know, that's a real growing need for local authorities. It's not necessarily currently covered by our sector-led approach, but actually councils want this, and we need to step up and help with that place leadership role in terms of delivering that. I think secondly, there's an emphasis now even more so than ever on experienced leaders. And although we've always offered a traditional approach around our Leadership Academy, Leadership Essentials, Next Generation programme, I've seen over the last 12 to 18 months a greater emphasis around what happens then. Because you're always learning as a leader. You may step in and learn the basics, but actually once you're a returning leader, what are the opportunities to continue to lead, to share best practice with colleagues, to understand future direction of travel? And we've started to bring forward a few different programmes around that, Future Vision, most notably, but I think there is also a greater opportunity there, particularly then when we get into the space around system leadership and where the role of local authorities fit in with ICSs, with combined authorities, and other opportunities in that space. And I would also say that links into a need for a bit of a paradigm shift too. Certainly, we've had a lot of talk over the last few years in terms of money. We haven't got enough money to deliver what we need, but actually, as I think has already been referenced, we're into a different space. New words and terms are entering our lexicon. Around target operating models, the new settlement that we talk about between central and local, and transformation. Again, Jonathan's already mentioned headlines at the moment around the NHS and that new space. So I think there's an opportunity there for us to help work with local authority leaders around that move from politicking into practicality. We're always, as politicians, going to want to champion our political views around this, but there is something for me at the heart of around how you deliver for your place. And then finally, sharing that best practice. How do we continue to do that? And I'm always minded by that line that appears so often in so many of the documents that I see through my LGA role that says local authorities are responsible for their own performance, but actually as a whole sector, we are responsible for what we do together. And I think there is a real moment here for us to come together as a sector to understand what the potential and opportunities are. As ever, Jonathan, the questions are always the best part of these sessions, so very much looking forward to that. Thank you.
Many thanks, Abby. That's extremely valuable and much appreciated perspective from the LJ, from your side. On the place leadership, I'm with you too. No, 3 is the magic number in rhetoric, as in panels by Forster. Now, Colin, we can't see you, but can you come in to speak to us at all?
Yeah, can you? I can see myself, but you can't see me.
Well, it's like we can hear you. You can be like our Delphic oracle, Colin. So please,
okay,
now you're and here we are, Colin. We see you.
Well, it was probably better before, but anyway, I'll carry on anyway. Jonathan, I just wanted to say that I think the report that Localis has just produced is going to be one of the most important reports in the foreseeable future. We spend a lot of time, sort of ironically really, in local government talking about place when we are places already. Now, I know that the term place doesn't mean quite the same thing depending on who's using that term, but it's very interesting in how we put this importance on that word. But often it's used to mean that areas, communities need to be shaped to suit public services, as opposed to public services being shaped to support the existing places that we have. And I'll give you an example of that. I mean, quite apart from the fact in England we never stop wanting to reorganise local government. A while ago, the Welsh Assembly, Welsh Government, suggested that its local government should be reorganised on the same footprint as the National Health Service. Now, if there's any organisation local government should not emulate in any fashion whatsoever, it's the NHS. But the idea that we need to structure place to suit public services, I think, is looking down the wrong end of the telescope. What we need to be looking at is how do we shape services to suit those places and those communities that we've got. And I think what's set out in this report is a step in that direction. Because what we have in this country, not unique by any manner of means, but what we have is a very fragmented landscape of public service provision. Now, we've already mentioned the NHS, but there are other organisations both in the public sector and the private sector, that are responsible for providing public services, spending public money, making public policy decisions that have an impact on communities for decades to come, but do that regularly without a single vote ever being cast. And the only organisation that we have that has that electoral mandate and that weds it to place in the way that many other public service organisations aren't is our local authorities, and our councillors, that, as Abby so aptly described, are there to get the best for the places that they represent. And I think that's the role that we need to be looking at in improving and transforming public services. If we've been through a period of local government being hollowed out, or services being transferred from local government into other providers, or we've had services coming back into local government, and which no doubt at some point will leave again, this constant churn of responsibilities, which, you know, it's the centre's sort of obsession with reorganising one way or another until it finally gets it right, which of course it never will do, because as it changes, other things change as well. The constant in our landscape of public services is our councils, and they need to have a role in integrating the policies of external agencies and bodies, and in shaping and influencing and holding to account all of those other organisations that are associated with public services. And I was very interested, you know, in Abby's points about the need for cross-party working. Of course, you know, you will know and you will have experienced how much easier it is to generate that cross-party working when you're not looking at the council of which you've been elected to. If you're looking at an external body or an external agency, councillors are much more ready, I think, to work cross-party, because they're not looking at the administration of their authority, and those usual party political hackles don't start to rise quite so much. So I think we need to be looking at an enhanced role for our councils in holding those public service bodies to account, wherever it happens to be. To a certain extent, we ask the big question, does it matter who delivers, so long as what they delivers has some form of link to a democratic mandate, has some form of mechanism for accountability, and has some form of way in showing that it's responding to the challenges that it faces and those that are there to hold those organisations to account. And I think that's where we are very weak at the moment, in that whole aspect of accountability. And so I think, you know, if anybody is going to hold the police, the health service, all of those other public service providers together, it's our elected council, because if they don't do it, no one else will, and no one can. And I know quite often the NHS will say, yeah, senior officers will say, well, we're responsible to ministers. Well, I don't fall for that, I'm afraid. I don't think that, you know, level of accountability is anything like the sorts of things that you can get from an empowered local authority and from empowered councillors that really have the ability to shape what other organisations do. And I suppose my final sort of point, by way of introducing or getting into the discussion, is just twofold, but I'll do this quickly. We talk about devolution. I think we need to be careful. The English devolution bill, from what I picked up so far, isn't devolution to England. It's not devolution to England through the formation of an English Parliament in the same way that there is a Scots Parliament and a Welsh Assembly. It's decentralisation. And yet again, I think we see England and English public services being undersold. We aren't seeing new autonomies, new powers, new freedoms, new responsibilities come to local government. Be great if they do, and I hope I'm wrong, but I don't detect that. What I detect is this ability of the centre to restructure responsibilities and restructure some funding, but not genuine devolution through liberating, if you will, our councils, which would be devolution rather than decentralisation. Abby might have, and indeed Sean might have, different views on this, but I'm not naturally a cynic. It's just experience that leads me to be cynical. And I suppose my final point is the other thing that worries me, and I think this is where this report is a good counterbalance. The other thing that worries me at the moment is the government, as with the last government, the government's focus for devolution seems to be at the moment anyway very much on combined authorities. And I think we need to draw that into our existing councils, allow them to do the role of a combined authority when it comes to place shaping, when it comes to holding other organisations to account, but without all that palaver and structure and reorganising that goes with combined authorities. So I think if anything can drag the devolution debate back to our local authorities as they exist, is a good thing. And I think there's plenty of material in this report that enables that debate to take place. And thank you.
Well, many thanks, Sean, Abby, Colin. Well, that's nice timing. So it's half and half. I think we've had extremely powerful and eloquent exposition of what we're trying to make in the report, Half to the Matter, making that foundational case about why we need this reform for placemaking and service provision. But now it's over to you, our audience, to come up with the questions for the panel to debate. We've got the Q&A box, which is quite empty at the moment, but you can lob them into chat. We won't be precious about that. And I see that Jonathan Flowers has made a point without reading the report, but do read it, Jonathan. It is a right good read, not just saying that in a self-interested basis. But I guess the question you're asking is, how can we ensure that places are empowered to transform in a way that's relevant for their local identity, I guess, including being democratically accountable, having input into health, so it's not just a dredge phrase. I do try to ban it, but it's there, one size fits all. How can we transform places in a way that respects locality and democratic accountability? Going back to Colin's point, so it's not a stamp of devolution. From how can we have essentially have it all, as in a devolution and an empowerment of local public service delivery, which inspires and empowers our communities? Is there any evidence we've seen from our report or around the country to make that work? And second comment we can pick up on, obviously big day for health service today. Any thoughts about the experience of ICSs and the potential for local authorities to step into that place? Clearly, one of the big emphasis of Heart of the Matter is the role of the local state in aiding and abetting prevention, which should be sort of a grist to the mill for what's being spoken of today. So yeah, put out to the panel. Anyone stick up your hand or just speak into your mic. Sean, you got your hand up first.
And give it a go. And thank you, Jonathan and Jonathan Flowers, for the question. I mean, I think it's just to reiterate the point, and I'm not just saying this for the puff point, that it is a very good read. And here's the thing that you'll find from reading the report is that you'll find yourself nodding all the way through it, not nodding off, nodding and agreeing with the points that are made. And here's the other thing with that, is that many of the points that have been made are the points that we in the sector have been making for many years. And I think, just to sort of focus in on the question that Jonathan Flowers has asked, is I think we've spent an awful lot of time over the last few years talking about structure. We've been talking about structure through which we can evidence how we can produce positivity and transformation for our places. But I think the thing that the report focuses on most is not the structure, it's the how. It's what are the characteristics, what are the behaviors that we need to see that are based around what actually might make the difference. And I think that how is the very important point. Just to, sort of within the report, it does have some very high level sort of themes. And one is empowering local leadership, something that Abby and Colin have focused on, which is making sure that local leadership is actually empowered, whether that's through the structures of devolution, decentralization, or actually recognizing that place leaders have got the ability to take risk. Apologies, I'll be here with fire alarm test in the background. taking a preventative approach, actually making sure that we're investing to the left of the plans and making sure that we're actually, this comes through the Darby report, comes through everything, just actually making prevention happen. It's the characteristic that we really need to see. Having a collaborative culture, making sure that we actually invest in collaboration rather than in division, those points that Abby made about cross-party working, making sure that we're collaborating up and down through the chain at regional level, right down to community and parish level, and to the point that was made in the Joe's point, which is having community co-design, having the communities involved in their places in order that the social infrastructure, all the other elements that are based around making places work, are actually engaged and involved. I think the last characteristic, and it is featured, and it does feature in the report, is optimism. Having a little bit of optimism that we can actually now grab this agenda for once, make place and the agenda around holistic transformation something that we really need to achieve, and use this, as I described earlier, as a generational shift.
Many thanks indeed for responding, Sean. Abby or Colin, want to get your tuppence in?
So I will jump in quickly. I think one of the things that sometimes we maybe don't put enough emphasis on is that relationship between members and officers, and where that sits in setting that agenda around transforming places. As I said when I started, I genuinely am the woman who walked in off the street and ended up leading a council. Now, I had a little bit of an advantage. I had worked for a council for 4 years, but I learned far more in the 8 years that I was a cabinet member than I learned prior to that, working for a council, and equally having studied at university politics and doing various seminars on local government, things like that. And the question always in interviews for local authorities is, what's the how do members and officers work together? And it's that bit about professional advice, but members making decisions. And I'm not sure sometimes necessarily that we have enough emphasis on reminding both members and officers of that space. And I know I won't be alone in often going into authorities, not always, but sometimes where politicians do things and almost entirely disregard the professional advice of officers, but equally also into other places where the professional officers disregard the role of elected members. And I think it is a crucial balance. The role of the politician does not solely change the transformation of a place. The greatest things that I have done have been in collaboration with officers. They have not been my ideas that weren't turned into something else. And equally, they weren't ideas of officers that just landed. And one of my chief execs once said to me, the magic happens where the leader and the chief exec are in the same place. And I think there is also a need for us to work on that. It's awful actually to go into local authorities and to see those two dynamics at play, where either members don't feel that they're able to bring their experience of community leadership into play in terms of decision making and strategy setting. And it's also really awful to go to places and hear officers who are giving professional advice and are basically being dismissed because members have a particular standpoint that they refuse to have challenged. And there's a difference between challenge of political views and actually practical reality of perhaps sector strength or traditional things that happen, or so on and so forth. I know it's a really hard one to crack, and I've had my moments with officers, and I'm sure officers feel that they probably had their moments with me. But for me, that is part of the sector element of this, and where do we play as a sector in terms of continuing to have that conversation about the interplay between elected members and professional officers.
Many thanks, Abby. Now, Colin, you've conducted a lot of research, in fact wrote a book about the role of the councillor. How do you see that dynamic between elected members and senior officers working in tandem to deliver for place?
I think if it works well, and generally it does, then place benefits from an understanding between elected members and officers of a shared direction and a shared set of goals. What is it that we want to achieve over whatever period of time? Now, if that relationship works well, as I say, then our places, our communities benefit from that. If it doesn't work well, and I mean, Abby mentioned where the magic happens, sometimes that can be black magic. Sometimes that doesn't necessarily have to be, a positive outcome. When those relationships break down, quite often the public are only aware of it because of what they pick up from the press locally, and they may well be completely unaware that those relationships are broken down. But where they do, and particularly that relationship between the leader and the chief executive, if that crumbles for some reason or another, then that can have a poisonous effect throughout the whole of an organisation. I think the danger we have is that we very often, there's a tendency, fortunately it's calmed down a little bit recently, but a little while ago there was a tendency to blame members for everything that went wrong, particularly in relationships with officers, and there were demands a while ago for councils to be able to suspend members and for 6 months or so and remove them from the council. I was always very sceptical of that because of the way in which it could be misused. And I think when you get to that sort of position, it's too late. What you need to be able to identify is when relationships, for whatever reason, are beginning to crumble. And sometimes that's for political reasons. Sometimes, more often not, it's for personal reasons. Different skill sets, different approaches to the way in which things ought to be dealt with, different assessments about priorities, and sometimes we have to be quite honest, just personality clashes. Some folk don't get on, and we have to recognise that. And you can't legislate that out of a system. And I think with the relationship between officers and members, it's often that tussle, for want of a better word, over who governs. Robert Dole's famous book about who governs the United States. Sometimes we have those tussles within our councils. Who governs? Is it the elected member, or is it the officer? And of course, the member is responsible and held to account by the electorate. Officers and senior managers and professionals are held to account by their members. That's part of the job of any councillor, is to hold senior officers to account, to challenge, to question, to explore, and to get the advice that fits in with the journey that members want to take. So I don't think that we ought to be too concerned about easing these things out of local authorities. I don't think we need to get to a position where there is no conflict, because sometimes conflict generates solutions to our sort of intractable problems, so long as all you do isn't conflict, so long as you're able to operate beyond those boundaries. And it depends on, I mean, again, Abby and elected members across the country will know, one councillor doesn't stand again or isn't re-elected, and the whole dynamic of a council can change. One officer gets another job and moves, the whole dynamic can change. And I think what we have to be aware of is, because of that tendency to change, we're always looking at creating new sets of relationships between members and officers. There isn't a magic wand. It takes a lot of work on the part of both members and officers to get those working relationships right. And I just throw this into the pot as well. You look at how councillors in particular are often now faced with building relationships, not only with officers within their council, but officers, managers, policymakers within all of these other organisations we were talking about earlier. All of that effort and energy that operates on both a strategic level, so council leaders, cabinet members, scrutiny chairs, negotiating with other organisations on a strategic level, and the ward member contacting and trying to build connections with managers and decision makers on an operational level in other organisations too. So it's a multifaceted problem of constantly building new relationships and improving existing ones.
Many thanks, Colin. And briefly segued, because moving aside from the internal council management, heart of the matter focuses a lot on the need for strong collaboration with local authorities as the apex collaborator in place. Got a couple of questions in the chat about those relationships with the diplomatic relationships with the central government, the civil service, city deals mentioned by a colleague, and Dave Atkinson talks about the a collaboration across all public service providers, delivering transformation, place shaping, for the new towns and all the rest of it. What do you think the impetus has to be for driving not just better but more effective collaboration with local government at the necessarily at the lead as the biggest, the most selfless, and ultimately, if this is going to work, successful collaborator to make this all work, to provide the ultimate stick for all the candy floss that's needed. In fact, as a sort of addendum to that, I think in the where we are now, I think Georgia Gould's role in the Cabinet Office will be very crucial to this. And a lot, as with the Darsley report today, it's not necessarily about new money, but as Georgia Gould in fact reflected immediately after reflection and was picked up, it's about the efficiency of money in the system getting to where it's needed at the level of place most urgently. So how do we see any thoughts about wider collaboration and making money, resources flow more efficiently through those public service partnerships and arrangements of all sorts and types? Anyone want to pick up on that?
Shall I go in first, and I'll try not to bring it back to members this time. For me, fundamentally, it's about relationships, isn't it? It is about knowing your place. One of my things that I enjoyed doing, particularly when I was leader of the council, was that when the government would come forward with a box, I would say it's a really nice box, but I'd like a blue box or a red box, or actually I'd like a slightly different shaped box. And the negotiation, now maybe that's a reflection of my sort of characteristics and personality, but I was often frustrated talking to colleagues that sometimes when the government would present you with X fund or X box to bid for, everybody just said, and how do I fit in the box? Well, my place isn't like any other place. And there's been some really interesting comments in the chat about size and geography. But fundamentally, leadership is about knowing your place, knowing what that driver is, which could be your stick, Jonathan, for your candy floss, and understanding the drivers of your partners and where the similarities are that form those relationships that create the success. Now, it could be for you as a local leader, and I don't think it is necessarily just for always, for example, the local authority leader or the chief exec. I think there's some good examples in different places where you can see health service leadership, or indeed other anchor institution leadership who say, I'm going to be the one who's going to go forward. And I see that it is poverty, it is children in care, it is economic growth, it's culture that should be the driver, because they have successfully mapped the interests and the drivers around that ecosystem and managed to bring people together around it. I guess you're in a tremendous place where there's a huge amount of enthusiasm and leadership, and almost a fight around what the most exciting stick to have is for your candy floss. But I think essentially that's what we need. And for me, some of this is the open-mindedness of us as a collective, as civic institutions, as an environment, to want to have that conversation, as opposed to be looking to the government to tell us perpetually that we should all come together around what they tell us the key drivers are. Now, of course, it's always helpful if your key driver happens to tick a government box, but actually that then flows back, doesn't it, if you do what the government tell you, into the box around the beauty pageant bidding. Fundamentally, for me, it comes down to knowing your place and being able to build relationships with your stakeholders, with your partners, to understand what that thing you have in common is and how you work together to achieve it.
Many thanks, Abby. Sean or Colin, anyone wants to come in on that role about relationships, collaboration, and getting good circulation of resources? Sean.
Just make a very quick point. I mean, it's a path well trodden, because we obviously got late Bob Kerslake, who tread the path before, but we've obviously now had the announcement recently of Tom Reardon going into the Department for Health and Social Care. I think the more we see an opportunity for people who are perceived as being in one sector moving into the other, moving from central government to local government and back again, the more that we have people who have actually got more insight as to how the various different pieces fit together, the more able we are to break down these myths around what happens within local government happens within central government. I think there is a huge degree of mythology. I'm struck by, I mean, Jonathan, you'll be aware that I spent a number of years leading an organisation called Local Partnerships, partly owned by the Treasury, partly owned by the LGA, partly owned by Welsh Government. And my character was split into many different characteristics as a consequence of who I was speaking to. And I can say this now because it's amongst friends, and it's fairly safe to say, I'm sure. When I was speaking to Treasury colleagues, they would see me as one of those local authority upstarts. When I was speaking to people within local authorities and the LGA, they would see me as a Treasury spy. When I spoke to Welsh Government, they just wanted to get the job done. They wanted to know how I could get consultancy in there at the cheapest possible rate. And so I had to have many different characteristics. But I did want and always had this mission, which was to break down the mythology and argue back when I heard anything come through the civil servant. It was parent-child relationship sort of attitude towards local government, and any kind of notion that anything that came from the Treasury was obviously there just to catch you out, because I think it's very easy to fall into that. I'm very hopeful that Tom Reardon and Georgia Gold and all of those appointments that are going into there will give us the opportunity to mix things up a bit so that we can break down those myths.
Many thanks, Sean. Paul, any thoughts from you, please?
Yeah, I very interesting listening to what Sean was saying. That need to be able to understand the audience that you're talking to and understand what they want from you and how they perceive you. That's one way of constructing successful negotiations and influencing is to be able to understand the person you're talking. Who is the person with the money and what do you want from them? Who is the person with the ability to provide something and what do you want? And very much again taken by sort of Abby's mention of the bidding process. This is local government in that classic naughty child role of the government wants to give you something. They're not going to tell you exactly what it is, and they're not going to tell you exactly what they want or how you're supposed to do it. They want you to tell that, and then they will decide if you're good enough to be able to do it. I think we have to break that nonsense down. I think that attitude is part of the problem that we have at the moment, is that often, not only are local government in bidding wars, they're in guessing wars as well. Have we got the right hand? Are we using the right language? I mean, much like academics, however, we would shape a bid to hear what we think reviewers wanted to hear and then spend the money how we wanted to. But I don't think academics are monitored in the same way that local government is. So I think, we need to break that down. One of the questions in the chat mentioned about a renaissance of local government and mentioned Victorian local government. I think the issue was, if we look at what we might, probably not completely accurately call the golden age of local government. Local government was often pioneering in those days, in the big cities where, they were pioneering the provision of vital public services, gas, water, electricity, sewage. All of those things were coming from a relatively more free local government than we have at the moment. And when I look at many council chambers, I come back to the issue Abby raised about relationship with members. Don't never be ashamed of coming back to members. I think it's absolutely right to do that. Sometimes the issue for members is that deep frustration that they feel. We want to do this. We want to be able to achieve this. We know how to improve and reform our place. Just let us get on with it. And then the government says, well, anyway, this is what we want you to do. So I think that frustration explains an awful lot. But we need to be thinking very much. I mean, the centre needs to be thinking, I would say, about how local government has performed in the past. Not the bad, not the 80s, not the mandate wars of the 1980s, but how local government and our cities and areas used to perform, and the sorts of pioneering spirit that they had, and free that up to enable councils. Councils have the right. I'm going to say this with the risk of being shot down. Councils and councillors have the right to fail. They don't have the right to be failures, but failing only comes from experimenting and trying something and then reorganizing and reshaping and getting it.
We cannot hear you, Colin.
There you go. Did you miss all of that? Do you want me to start again?
No, please, no. That's a lot.
I must have let it. Anyway, I'll just say this. I think that the centre is so now its future, parliamentary future, is so wound up with what happens through public services that it feels the need to control what local government and other providers do. It cannot risk the sorts of things that maybe in the past it was willing to risk because its future is so tied up. And I think that's with public service. And I think that's one of the things that we need to break down and to relocalise our political system. That's how you will start to get some of the renaissance that I think one of the comments mentioned.
Many thanks, Colin. Well, look, we're in the final straights now, approaching the last 5 minutes. Really pick up on the final couple of themes. Two related, really. One is, Jeremy Cooper asked, what is good growth? Can we distinguish it from bad? Clearly, the overarching mission of the government is to drive growth. What's good opposed from bad? And really, as a following on from what you were saying, Colin, about what would be necessary for a renaissance, a renewal, that spirit of hope and optimism Sean was talking about, which hopefully we've embedded in the report. What would a renaissance of local government and whole place transformation potentially deliver if it could, and what might be necessary? So any thoughts about good growth and a renewal and a renaissance of the local state in any particular order?
Happy to have a crack at the good growth point, Jonathan. I think in relation to the sort of what would be bad growth, I think there's an example in the report of housing that's been built that isn't sustainable, that 20 years later gets demolished as a consequence of the fact that it's been done at a point in time where it's not built in, there isn't any social infrastructure, it's not the right housing, etc. And so those kind of short-term growth decisions that are taken that might well come as a consequence for what Abby mentioned around the beauty parade. We've got a bunch of funding that's coming in. How do we spend this funding? And it doesn't necessarily fit in the long-term holistic approach. I think the aspects that I would just sort of say in terms of, and it is a very pejorative word to use to describe something as good, but I would see good growth as being growth that's kind of sustainable. It means that you're thinking through the consequences that this is going to then kick on and make sure that there's a lasting impact as a consequence, and it appreciates quality rather than quantity whenever we're looking at that growth aspect. It's inclusive, and so for that reason, there's if I think about growth that involves housing, does it involve highly skilled jobs that are associated with that housing that can actually take advantage of where that is? Does it involve locals in that, so that good growth would not exclude those people where the growth is happening, so that they actually feel part of the growth journey? And then finally, that it's comprehensive to that point around social infrastructure, that it isn't just piecemeal, that we're thinking holistically, that we're thinking about the long term, we're thinking about generations beyond this point who have to take advantage of all of the things that need to fit into that growth infrastructure.
Sean, many thanks for that eloquent definition of what good growth could and should look like. Abby, any sort of final thoughts from you about what a true renaissance of local government might look like?
I think that's quite a difficult one, isn't it? So I'm glad that I'm going before Colin, because I'm sure he's got the answer to this. But I think it probably is, with my LGA hat on, I would say it is the resetting of that relationship, isn't it? The recognition of the importance of our places and where that is, and that reflection of the importance of elected members in whichever tier that is. And that's a recognition that governance is not uniform and will be different, and the needs of it will be different in different places, and respect for that. I think one of the things that I'm interested in seeing how it evolves is around the devolution settlement moving forward. I talked to colleagues about there being a reason that only that 48% of the country don't have a devolution deal. That's because we're the difficult places, the awkward places, the places where we maybe don't get on with each other, the places where it's not easy to get over the line. And there's varying degrees of how that will be resolved and maybe not resolved. But what will happen eventually, because there'll be some places that maybe don't fit into that neat jigsaw, simply because I don't think it's as easy to say this is the size of what we think you should look like as a place in there. So I guess maybe there is that opportunity, and to respond, I guess, to one of the other questions earlier on around that interaction between local and national. There is always an advantage, isn't there, at the start of a new government with a new administration coming in, as there is locally when there is a change of administration, in terms of what that relationship looks like. And this, in a way, is kind of our moment, isn't it, as a sector, to try and slay some of those dragons around the fact, those awful things that are said about local government, that we're all part-time amateurs, equivalent to Boy Scout leaders, that local government officers don't know what they're doing, and so on and so forth. So there's an opportunity to slay all that, isn't there? But also then to kind of put ourselves in that position of saying, actually, we can help to deliver some of your missions, and in return for that, we would like to do X, Y, and Z. So I guess in a way, the characteristics are around seizing our own agency, aren't they, in terms of this, to reassert ourselves.
Many thanks, Abby. Well, I'm going to have to call an end to proceedings now. I did promise we'd end at 12 noon. Colin, we'll hear from you later. But look, the show's not over, folks. We are going to have a follow-up webinar looking at mission-led government and how the whole place transformation agenda fits into this on the 10th of October. And we'll be taking this conversation, this dialogue, this report will live through further talks and discussions at the LGA conference in Harrogate for those who are able to get up there in good time. So I'm going to end with our sincere gratitude and thanks to our fantastic panel, Sean Hanson, Abby Brown, Colin Copus. Thanks to everyone, in fact, who took part in our dialogue sessions across the country. My fantastic research staff at Localis for writing this, and for Sean and for Erin Walsh for starting this project at the very beginning of the year, which has been a turbulent, interesting one, which ain't over yet. So, show's over for now, folks, but not over quite yet. Hope to see you next month, either online or in Harrogate. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye for now. Take great care. Thank you.